Now, moving overseas, the Philippines has just confirmed its first case of the Wuhan virus. The patient is a 38-year-old woman from China. The number of known Wuhan virus infections has jumped overnight by more than 1,700 to just under 7,800 in China. The epidemic's death toll also rose sharply, up by 38 since Wednesday. The total now is 170 dead, all in China. The virus has spread to all of mainland China's 31 provinces, municipalities and autonomous regions. The 38 new deaths included 37 in Hubei and 1 in Sichuan province. In a new development, a Chinese expert has claimed that the coronavirus can also be transmitted from mammal to mammal. But the World Health Organization disagrees and said that there was no evidence that pets such as dogs and cats could be infected with the virus. We have China Bureau Chief Tan Dong-wei to give us the latest. Hi, Don.
Hi.
Hi, Don. Now, it seems like, pets may be infected as well, but whether it can or not, the point is that the epidemic is getting worse and people are getting more paranoid. What's the latest development like in China?
Yeah, the numbers have shot up quite significantly since yesterday. There have been first cases identified in the Philippines, in India, in Finland, and the United Arab Emirates. And Tibet also has its first case now, which means that the disease has spread to all of China. The National Health Commission just held its daily briefing at 3 o'clock today, where it gave some updates. And one of them is about the acute shortage of protective suits that hospitals need. And the officials gave the assurance that they have made arrangements for these garments to be imported, and they are on the way. The Hubei governor had said yesterday that they are in such dire need of these protective suits that some medical workers have had to resort to wearing raincoats and use disposable garbage bags as shoe covers in order to protect themselves. And these doctors and nurses sometimes have to stay in the isolation wards for extended periods of time because they cannot afford to waste these supplies, as they would have to change into new ones every time they come in and out of the wards. And as the week-long spring festival holiday comes to an end, there are concerns that another travel crunch, where millions of people go back to the cities to work, will bring about another spike in infection numbers. And the officials at today's briefing also took pains to give the assurance that, whether it's planes or trains or buses, there will be stringent controls in place to deal with the crowd. So there will be temperature screenings, there will be on-site quarantine facilities, improved ventilation controls and disinfection. And they also encourage travelers not to travel during peak periods and to protect themselves by wearing a mask at all times and practice good hygiene.
Right.
So as the spread of the disease expands to more countries and in greater numbers, the World Health Organization is meeting in about 3 hours to decide whether to declare this epidemic a global health emergency. And if that happens, that means that there will be a more coordinated international response to this epidemic, and the WHO will be allowed to make recommendations on how to deal with this, the spread of this virus globally, such as recommending screenings at borders or issuing travel advisories.
I see. Now, Dawn, we just had a story earlier in the show about Singaporeans being evacuated out of Wuhan. More governments around the world seem to be intervening one way or the other. Can you tell us more about that?
Yes, the evacuations are taking place as we speak. We've had the 92 Singaporeans come home on a Scoot flight this morning. The United States also flew about 200 Americans out of Wuhan, and they were screened at a military base in California. South Korea and France have made arrangements, and Britain, Indonesia, Russia, Spain, Morocco, Australia, and New Zealand are also making plans to evacuate their citizens. These countries have varying degrees of screening their own nationals once they get home. Australia, South Korea, Singapore, and New Zealand, for instance, they will quarantine everyone whether or not they show symptoms. The United States and Japan have chosen to implement voluntary isolation. And in the case of Japan, that decision has caused some backlash because 3 people who returned tested positive for the coronavirus, even though they showed no symptoms. And the authorities had actually let 2 people go home without getting screened because these people refused to be tested. And according to my colleague, Japan correspondent Walter Sim, this issue has now blown up in Japan, and Prime Minister Shinzo Abe has had to explain to Parliament that there is no legal basis for the authorities to compel the citizens to go for further tests. Besides the foreigners who are being repatriated from Wuhan, Chinese Aviation Authority has also just approved charter flights to bring home Wuhan residents who are now stuck overseas because many domestic and international airlines have cancelled flights to and from the city.
Right. Now, Dawn, on a final note, before we let you go, what are your thoughts on the situation so far?
Wow, where do I even begin? When we first started tracking the story in December, my colleague Elizabeth Law went to Wuhan to report on site. And at that time, the outbreak had just started and the numbers were still relatively low and there was no evidence of human-to-human transmission. And people she spoke to seemed pretty relaxed about it. And, hardly anyone was wearing a face mask on the streets. And not a single person thought that it would suddenly spread so quickly and so aggressively, to consume the whole province and the whole country and to even spread overseas. So we still don't know, what more will happen and whether this epidemic will be severe and whether it will be prolonged. But there seems to be consensus that China is doing everything that it can to contain it. And even though there were some criticisms that it didn't act fast enough, I don't think anyone right now is really saying that it's not doing enough. So we will all just have to hope that it can be contained and there will be no new epicenters that will emerge in other parts of China or in the world.
Right. Once again, thank you so much, Dawn, for coming onto the show and letting us know what's happening overseas.